Hello everybody and welcome to my second of 3 videos on the Nikon F5. The first video we talked about what all the stuff is. In this video we're going to talk about what all the stuff does. First thing about your Nikon F5, you can do nothing whatsoever except admire the aesthetic beauty of this camera without batteries in it. So, to change batteries, you pull the battery pack out, whatever battery pack you have. And as I hammered home multiple times in video 1, if you can get your hands on the AA battery pack, you want to do that. So all you have to do is pull out the battery pack. If you have the AA's, you swap out the batteries. And yes, this, by the way, has been using these same 8 Eneloop Pros for more than a year. And I've run 50, 55, 60 rolls of film through it. And it doesn't even show these things as being discharged any. So they're a really good option for this camera. It takes 8 of them if you have the AA adapter, and then you just take them out, put it back in, lock it in place, and you're good to go. Next thing we're going to talk about is how to mount and unmount lenses, because what's the point of having an SLR if you're not going to change lenses? So to remove a lens, you push down on the lens release button here, and then you turn this clockwise until it stops and lift it off. You can do this at any point when you're not taking a photo without damaging your film or risking your images. If you don't do this, by the way, when you're taking a photo just to play around and experiment. That's a really good way to shatter your mirror. Next thing you're going to do is you're going to grab your replacement lens. You see this little index here, and there's a little white line right here to indicate your focus point. Those two things align. So you drop your lens in so that that focus index aligns with this white dot, and then you turn it counter or anti-clockwise until it clicks into place and you've changed your lens. So now that we're going to actually start going and taking photos, we should probably load some film. First thing we're going to do is push down on the on-off switch release, and we're going to turn the camera to on, and I am going to turn this down from 25-minute exposures to something more reasonable here. Yeah, that's better. So that I don't have the shutter hanging open for half an hour and keep making everyone bored. Well, more bored than they are watching this already. Okay, so next we're going to open up the back of the camera. I'm going to grab our roll of film, and we're going to load it in. Now the way that we load it is we take the film so that the top of the part that goes in the top of the camera, we put in first, okay? So this is the motion that you're going to make right here, just like this. And you can see there are DX code readers down there, by the way. This film doesn't have a DX code, but let me use a different roll of film that does, because that won't mess up the ISO. Okay, so here's a roll of film that has an actual DX code. What the DX code reader does is automatically understand the information in the DX code so that it knows what speed film you're dealing with. Now you pull the film out over here and put the leader into this side of the camera right there, and make sure that it's generally flat like that, okay? Now we're going to close the film back. And I think in video 3 that we'll cover whether or not it automatically advances or needs a shutter button press. We'll find out. It's been a few days since I wrote this script. Anyway, push the shutter button, advances 3 rolls. If you want to take the slack out, you can. That's a nice thing to do. This has a DX code reader on it, but it looks like I have my ISO set manually. So what I'm going to do is show you how to adjust the ISO on your camera. We lower that little cover. Now we're going to hold the ISO button down, and using the rear command wheel, which on mine is a trick wheel, it does not do what it's supposed to all the time. We're going to rotate through here until we find DX. I really hope it's at the bottom. There it is. Come on. Nope. So you can see there, it says ISO 400DX. If you see that DX indicator underneath the ISO, that means your camera's automatically reading the DX code and knows what your film speed is from it. If you're using a roll of film that does not have a DX code on it like this, there are some other specialty films like the some of the ADOX films, if not all of them. Also like some of the lomography films like Phantom A8 don't have a DX code. So film speeds that don't have DX codes associated with them aren't going to have that. So if you have a film that doesn't have a DX code, you can use the ISO button in your rear command dial to adjust the speed of the film yourself. That will also allow you, with DX coded film, to push and pull the film. Okay, so you've loaded your film, and you're going to go through your day and you're going to shoot photos. And if you see this film rewind knob turning, and I pulled the lever out just to make it easier to see. You don't actually want to leave that out. But if you see this turning when you take a photo, then you know for a fact that your film is moving through the camera properly. So you're going to go through your day, you're going to take photo after photo after photo, and you're going to go through your roll of film. Now, film is one and done, so it can record light or can absorb photons exactly one time, either in a controlled manner with a proper shutter speed and aperture, or in an uncontrolled manner by doing something relatively silly like this. If you open up your film back while the film is in it, all of the film that is out of the camera will be erased to any past or future photos, because what happens is that the crystals in the film that record the image, once they record light, they're spent. So you just don't want to do this. But I want to show you how the film moves through the camera when you take photos. Now we saw that the film rewind knob was turning, and that's because the film was being pulled off of the back out of the cassette. You can probably see there how it might be hard to see, but there's more film on the spool than there was before. And then when we get to the end of the roll, I'll show you how to rewind the film, and it just rewinds it back into the cassette. There we go, we're at the end of the roll, and as you can tell by opening the film back, it reset the frame counter, but we are at the end of the roll now. So to rewind the film, we're going to lift up this little cover right here, and we're going to push down button number 1. We're going to lift up this lever. I went the wrong way. We're going to push this button down and then lift up that lever. That was very fast. I always forget how fast this camera is. And you can see that the film rewind knob was spinning and the film rewind light was blinking, and that tells us that the film is being rewound into the cassette. So now we open up the film back. We can remove our cassette, grab our next one and keep shooting, or if we are done for the day, just close the back of the camera and turn it off. Okay, so now that we've put batteries in, mounted a lens, loaded film, we need to learn how to use a flash. The camera does include a hot shoe right up here. So you can mount a flash right on top here. It also includes a PC port right here with which you can connect a cabled flash, or you can use this to connect cables to studio lights, of course. We're going to talk about some very basic flash use with this camera. So we're going to mount the flash on the top of the camera like this, and just because this is the absolute worst place you can possibly put a flash. So some really basic flash technique is that the light leaving the flash here will go forward, reach your subject, bounce back to your lens. It will make them look very flat. So think about using the flash to replicate the way that light reaches our subjects in real life. For instance, if we're outside, the sun is above us, or at night, street lamps are above us, and indoors, generally speaking, building lights are above us. So our brains are predisposed to seeing people lit from above as people being lit naturally. So what we want to do with a flash, whether it's on the camera's hot shoe or not, ideally, you want to get one that can tilt like this. So you can point the flash up at the ceiling and bounce the light off of the ceiling. And then that gives you that replicates that natural look. Or if your subject's a little ways away, you can always tilt it forward. Even better than just a tilting flash is a fully articulating flash, which also rotates, so that you could bounce your flash off of the wall or off of a combination of wall and ceiling, whatever you felt inclined to do. When you use the flash on this camera, you want to set the camera's shutter speed to the flash sync, which is going to be a pain on this camera because it's set to 30-minute exposures. So we're going to go all the way to the long end of the exposure spectrum, and now we are at our X flash sync. There we go. So that will trigger the flash. Now if you are at 300, you cannot use the maximum flash power. You need to dial it back. I don't have the exact settings memorized for X300 versus X250. You'll want to consult the owner's manual for that if you need more information about it. Honestly, if you have this camera My guess is you've probably done enough flash photography to know what you need to do anyway. But at any rate, this is where you need to go. The other thing you can do is do any manual shutter speed that is the flash sync speed of 1/250th or slower. So if I want to do a 1.6 second exposure with a flash, I can do that. I could do a 50th of a second with a flash as well. So the reason for that is the way that the shutter curtains on this camera work. It has two curtains, and they're kind of hanging out like this all the time. When you take a picture, the first curtain drops, and then the second curtain follows, and then they reset immediately. So when you take a picture at 1/250th of a second, the first curtain drops, and the entire film plane is exposed to light for approximately a 2/50th of a second, and then the second curtain closes, and then this curtain, the first one, comes back up, and it resets. So this camera's maximum shutter speed is 1/8,000th of a second, but it doesn't have a faster shutter speed because the curtains physically move faster, but because the second one follows more closely behind. So at 1/8,000th of a second, the first curtain will start, and then the second one's going to come in right behind it. So if you use your flash, you'll probably end up with just a little strip of illuminated film right at the very bottom, and then everything else will be blocked by the shutter and dark. And then the shutter curtains reset. So, and one other thing you can do, by the way, I forgot to mention this earlier, I goofed. You can also use an RF adapter with this if you wanted to plug an RF adapter into the hot shoe, the PC port or the hot shoe. You could use your autofocus to focus and then hold a flash up into the side of your subject and get a little bit more flash power, or put a diffuser on it and dial it back and get a softer amount of light. And that would work as well for using flash with this camera. Anyway, forgot to mention that. So, this camera is really capable of using a flash. At 1/250th and 1/300th, one of the things this is really good for is what's called daylight fill flash, meaning that if you have a subject in full sun, they're going to have very harsh shadows on them, especially like at noon, because the sun's above them and their nose and their eyebrows and their chin are going to cast very harsh shadows on them. So if you have a very fast shutter speed of 1/300th of a second, and you're using a slow to a medium speed film, anything up to, well, actually with as fast, yeah, anything really up to around 400 ISO film, then what you can do is you can set the shutter speed to 1/300th, use a flash that's just powerful enough to cancel out those harsh nose and chin shadows, and then you'll have a subject who is evenly illuminated in the daylight by both the light overhead and some fill flash that is helping to eliminate the shadows that our bodies cast on themselves. Next thing we're going to do is talk about how to change the prism and the focusing screen, because you might need to do different types of photography. So this is the prism release button, and I'm going to hold it while I push the prism off of the back of the camera. I'm going to push it in with a screwdriver gently while I do this, because my fingers are too big to fit into that little impression. And this is the prism that was on the camera. It's right off the camera just like that. Now, to swap out the focusing screen, we just lift and we can remove the focusing screen. This also allows us, by the way, to get in there with a bulb blower very easily and clean off the sides of the screen if they get dirty. Now we can grab our other focusing screen. And what we're going to do is we're just going to lay it in here like this so that we're holding this little grip point, and we're just going to press it into the housing. Next, we're going to slide either the same or the new prism on until it clicks in place, and now we've accessed to clean or swap out both the prism and the focusing screen. Next up, let's talk about how to use the drive modes on this camera. So here are your drive modes, and what you do to adjust them is you push this button down and then you just rotate this dial. So we'll start at the very beginning. S stands for single shot. What single shot means is that you push the shutter button down and it will take a photo. And you can hold the button down as long as you want and it will never take another photo. Continuous low, continuous high, and continuous servo do the same thing but in different ways. All right, So continuous low will take photos as quickly as a camera can in this setting, as long as you hold the shutter button down. That's a rate of about 3 frames per second. Continuous high will do that same thing, but at about 7.4 frames per second. And then continuous servo, or single, I forget exactly what S stands for, is 1 frame per second. I guess that's maybe just continuous slow. Anyway, CS is 1 frame per second. And then the last option is the self-timer. In the self-timer, we'll see in video 3, custom function 16, if you want to find it right now, on how you can adjust the duration of the self-timer. When you're in self-timer mode, you push the shutter button, and this little red light right here is going to blink, and it'll speed up, or should speed up, when we get close to the end of the time, or just go solid, and then it will take the photo. Now that we know how to adjust the shutter speed, let's talk about how to adjust the metering. So here's the metering mode switch. This tells us we're in 3D matrix. 3D matrix only works if we have an AID or an AIG lens. Yes, this camera will work with G lenses. If you are interested in learning more about that exactly, the manual, which is linked in the video description, page 49. What this does is with AID and AIG lenses, it uses autofocus distance information to inform metering, as we talked about, but that's what this symbol means. We can then adjust we push in the lock release there, and we can turn the dial this way to center weighted. All right, so what center weighted does is it takes the central portion of the frame, something about like this, and it says 75% of the meter data is coming from this central area. The remaining 25 is coming from outside of this area. So center weighted can be really good for center framed subjects, such as portraits or whatever, and or is also a fairly decent general metering mode if you have a non-autofocus lens and want to use that. If you have a non-autofocus lens and you're in 3D matrix metering, you just have matrix metering. It takes out the 3D element to it. So specifically for center weighted, by the way, this camera uses a 12mm circle in the center of the frame for that 75% metering area. In addition, while we're in center weighted averaging, if you push the AEL-AFL button, what you can do is take a meter reading off the area of the frame that's outside of that center weighted circle. And that's really good. Let's say that you have a particularly dark or a particularly bright subject in the center, and you want to try to balance your exposure a little bit more. You could do the center weighted metering, take that additional meter reading, and then adjust your shutter speed either by program shifting or EV compensation or with manual shutter speeds to something between the two readings and split the difference on your setting. You can also, and we'll see this in video 3, custom function 14 if you need to check that out right now, that you can adjust the 12mm circle in the center to either 8mm or 20mm or full scene averaging metering. That's how you access full average metering, and that would still be this symbol right here if you went with that option. On the other side, the single dot is spot metering. Spot metering is almost 100% of the metering input coming from the central 1.5% of the frame, which is a 4mm circle. That's an area about like this on your current screen. If you are using focusing screen ECB, that changes to 3.3% of the focus of the frame, which is a 6mm circle. So, thought that was important to mention. Next thing we're going to talk about is your autofocus mode selection button, which is right here. And we're going to look right here at this symbol. So you can see that there's a little box with 5 plus signs, 4 outside of it and 1 inside of it. If we push this button, so what we're going to do to adjust the autofocus the autofocus mode, we're going to push this button that has a plus on it. We're going to rotate the rear command wheel, and those pluses either disappear or come back. All right, what does that mean? When the pluses are there, you have dynamic autofocus, which will activate all 5 of those autofocus points, which is those 5 pluses. And you can select which one you want to have be most active by, come on, there we go, by using the cross pad on the back to select the autofocus point you would like to have be most active. Or if you want only center weighted, or the center autofocus point to be active, there you go. Single area, we'll select that one. If you want a different single area, this will allow you to control with the cross pad which one of the 5 autofocus points will be active. So if you don't see the pluses, only one autofocus point is active and you can select it. If you do see the pluses, all 5 will be active, but the one you select is the one that the camera is going to favor. All right, next up, let's talk about shooting modes with this camera. You can see here that says M. I'm going to push down the mode button and rotate the dial, and we have P, S, A, and M. Those are the 4 options. We'll start here with P, which is program. In program mode, let me adjust the aperture so it will stop blinking at me. In program mode, the camera with the correct kind of AID or AIG lens will pick the best aperture and shutter speed. Program mode is not really going to work if you have an NAI or pre-AI or others, or AIS lens, for instance. So if your camera can read the aperture information from the lens, it will pick the best shutter speed and aperture in this mode. Okay? And you can see as things are going on that it's going to tell you what it's going to do. Okay? And as light levels adjust, you can see it's going to give us different aperture and shutter speed combinations. If I rotate, so basically that's what program mode does, is it will evaluate the scene and it will give you the information about the selections it's going to give you for shutter speed and aperture. If we hold down mode again, we can rotate, and now we're in S. S is shutter priority. Now you can see no matter how the light level changes here, that the 50th of a second is staying the same. In shutter priority, what happens is that you tell the camera what your shutter speed is going to be, and it tells you based on the lighting what the aperture needs to be, and then it will do that, just like that. Our next mode is going to be aperture priority, which is exactly the same but the opposite. Here you can see as the light changes, the shutter speed is changing, but the aperture is staying the same. If I rotate the rear command wheel, if I rotate the front command wheel, I can adjust the aperture, and then the shutter speed will adjust as well. And whatever I pick for the aperture, the camera is going to give me a shutter speed that will give me a proper exposure. Hit the mode button and rotate one more. Now we're at manual. In manual, the rear dial controls the shutter speed and the front controls the aperture, and the camera will do what you tell it to do, regardless of whether or not that's right. So you dial in your settings, and then the camera does what you tell it, just like that. In any of these modes, you can also do what's called EV compensation. So I'm going to show you how to use the EV compensation button. It's a little bit easier to see in the automatic modes. So F5, 20th of a second, I'm going to hit the EV compensation button, and now this pops up on the screen. That symbol lets you know that you have activated EV compensation, and the 0.0 is how much. Right now, nothing. But if I rotate the rear command wheel, I can now force the camera to underexpose the image by 1/3 of a stop or more. You can keep going up to 5 stops. So you can see aperture hasn't changed, but that drastically changes the shutter speed. Now we're back to it was at 40, 50th, 60th of a second in that range. That is a massive, massive exposure difference between a 40th and a 50th of a second, or a 2,000th of a second. You can go 5 stops in the other direction as well. And you can do that in every one of the modes. In the automatic mode of program mode, the camera will do the calculation for you. Same thing in the semi-automatic modes of aperture priority and shutter priority. In full manual, the camera will give you an appropriate meter reading so that you can adjust the settings yourself to over or underexpose your images. Now let's have a look at the functions that are on the front of the camera and what they do. This is our depth of field preview button, and as you can see, it stops the aperture down so that we can see what the depth of field is roughly going to look like for the photo. This is the MLU button, which we talked about in the second video, and you can use in conjunction with the self timer, remote control release, a tripod, to bring the mirror up before you even press the shutter so that there's no mirror shake in the camera when you take the photo, and that really does help give you very good shake-free results for image types that have very critical focus, such as macro photos and star trails are the two most common examples of that. We talked a little bit about your autofocus switch and those in the first video, and that's really it for the front of the camera. On the back of the camera, we have the cross-pad, which controls the autofocus point selection. Here we have the AEL-AFL button. What this does is this locks both your focus and exposure, at least in the default setting. I believe that there's a custom function to adjust how this behaves. Yes, there is. In video 3, custom function 21, if you want to check it out right now, allows this button to be set to lock both autofocus and auto exposure, or just one or the other. And in video 3, we'll go through how to do that. So with spot metering selected, you can lock focus and lock metering on a small area, such as a person's face, which would allow you to recompose your image and take a photo with a better composition. So for instance, let's say that you are sitting in the shade of a tree with a big field in the background, and you're with a friend, and you want to take a photo of your friend. If you turn on spot metering, and you lock the focus on your friend's face, and hold AEL-AFL down, what you do is you just take a meter reading with them in the center of the frame, and then you hold this down. Your focus will not change. This is assuming, of course, you have the default setting activated. And then your meter reading won't change. And then if you want to slide your friend's face over here to the side so you can get the hills and field behind them as well, albeit a little bit blown out, you could do that. And that's how you can use this to lock your focus and exposure to recompose your frame for a better photo. In aperture value, or in aperture priority shooting, your aperture can be adjusted while you hold your AEL-AFL button down, and the shutter speed will compensate to provide a correct exposure, which means that if you hold this down and you're like, oh, I don't want to lose critical focus, but I just realized I have the wrong aperture, you can adjust it, and your camera will compensate for the exposure difference with a different shutter speed. You can also use that to bracket your exposures if you wanted to do that with different proper exposures of different shutter speeds and apertures. One thing to note is that your metering systems cannot be changed while you press this button down. I mean, the switch might physically work because they're not connected, and I can, just testing it right now, can tell you it will, but your camera, when you lock this down, when you push this button, locks your exposure and focus values in place. So even if you tell it to change metering modes, it's not going to, because it's not going to change those values. If you shoot with your focus here to the S, which is autofocus single servo, when you push this button down, only the exposure lock is recorded. The shutter being held down halfway in that scenario will be what locks the focus. And in manual focus mode, when you have the focus dial here set to M, only the AEL, only the exposure rather, will be locked. Focus obviously isn't locked because you're controlling it manually on the lens. Next up, your AF on and AF on buttons. This is the upper and the lower, and they do the exact same thing. It's just a matter of where your hand is when you're taking photos. Are you holding it to take photos portrait, or are you holding it to take photos landscape? In video 3, custom function 5 is set to, when it is set to option 1, you'll see how to do that in video 3, autofocus on starts and stops autofocus, not the shutter button. So custom function 5 in video 3 might explain that better, but when that's set to option 1, this is your autofocus button, not your shutter button. That's a good way to prevent accidental exposures, by the way, because it is easy to accidentally push a shutter button down just a little bit too far and start taking photos. And when you only have up to 36 per roll, that can eat into your ability to take a good photo when you want to. This is also good for situations where objects or other things might come between you and your subject, because you can very easily release this button when something like a person's head is between you and what you're tracking with your camera. And then you can just keep firing away. You maybe lose a frame or two to a person's head, but you don't lose your focus of this thing that's moving sideways through your frame. Next thing we're going to talk about is the flash button, which is this button right here. With all 5 of these buttons, we have to hold them down when we use them. So I'm going to hold down the flash button, and now we have 3 symbols. Slow, rear, and normal. Those are the 3 symbols, okay? With normal, you get what's called front curtain sync. Now, if you remember, earlier in the video, we talked about the first curtain drops and then the second curtain follows. In normal, when that first curtain drops, at this moment, this is when the flash fires. If you're shooting a shutter speed that's 1/250th of a second, it doesn't matter. Even 1/60th of a second, it doesn't really matter exactly which mode. The flash will fire here, and for all intents and purposes, it doesn't matter whether or not it's at the beginning of the exposure or at the end, which we'll see in just a second. The next option we have is what's called, we're going to do rear next. The next option we're going to look at is rear curtain right here. So when you have the rear curtain sync set up, what that does is normal, the flash fires now. Rear, the flash fires right before the second curtain drops. So let's say you're shooting at a 2/50th of a second. Who cares? It doesn't matter. It's functionally the exact same thing. But if you're shooting a 10-second exposure, that's significantly different. With a 10-second exposure, you can have the flash illuminate something after it's traveled through your frame. And especially if it's like a car that has lights on it, or a bike that's got reflectors and you have a couple of dimmer lights that don't illuminate it, just with the reflectors, something like that, you can make it look like you have a frozen subject over here and then lights trailing off behind it through the frame. So that's a good and creative use of how you can show motion in a frame from a frozen subject with your rear flash. If you're just going to be using flash for portraits or whatever, really doesn't matter. And you can leave it. And another good use of rear flash is, let's say you need to take like a 5 or 6 second photo of a friend at night with a cityscape in the background. You can set that to rear curtain sync and then tell them, just stay there and look at the camera, and after the flash fires, you can stand up. That ensures that they stand there and block any lights that are behind them from showing up in the image until the flash fires and you capture them in focus and well illuminated, so then you have the cityscape behind them as well as your friend in the frame. All right, slow shutter curtain. What this does is that in your automatic modes, which is P, S, or A, program, shutter priority, or aperture priority, the camera will pick a shutter speed that is between 1/250th and 1/50th instead of just 1/250th. If we're in standard mode, like we are right now, the camera is going to use the flash sync speed in an automatic photo mode setting. Here we go, back to slow. This mode does not apply to manual exposure settings when you select a slower shutter speed than the flash sync speed. This mode is only for the automatic and the 2 semi-automatic exposure modes. And by the way, one other thing about rear, the reason it says slow right now is because I'm in an automatic mode. If I adjust this to manual, there we go, the slow goes away because I'm setting my own shutter speed. So with the automatic modes, if that slow is there, the camera's limiting itself to 1/250th to 1/50th. If that slow isn't there when you're in manual mode, it's telling you, you can pick anything slower than 1/250th of a second, and the rear curtain sync will be, which is when the second curtain starts its travel, is when the flash will fire. This mode also, by the way, works really well in bulb shooting. Next thing we're going to do is talk about how to bracket your photos. Now, what a bracketing, if you're not familiar with the term, is you have a proper meter reading right here. Okay, let's pretend this is an exposure bar. You have a proper meter reading, 1/125th and f/5/6. This is too little light. Maybe it's 1/500th and f/5/6. And this is too much light. Maybe it's 1/15th and f/5/6. So you have that whole range. Bracketing will take multiple photos across this range, because if you don't know exactly what your perfect exposure should be, well, at least you're hedging your bets. Or if you want to maybe try to capture one image that has very dark shadows and a nice, evenly illuminated sky, and one that has a completely blown out sky and evenly illuminated shadows, just to see what you like the best, you can do that as well. Bracketing is a good way to hedge your bets to make sure that you get a good photo in complex lighting situations. So now understanding what bracketing is, let's talk about how to read what the camera is telling you on the LCD display when you bracket it. To start bracketing, you hold the bracketing button down. Now we see this display. I'm going to rotate the rear command wheel until bracket appears. And now we are ready to start bracketing. And as you can see, it counts down the number of frames. But it doesn't tell us the number of frames specifically. The bar disappears, and then it tells us the exposure value compensation that we're going to get with the photo that we're about to take. And in the continuous modes, it will do one bracketed sequence, and it won't just keep on going so that you waste film. Okay, so now that we have bracketing selected, I'm going to hold down the bracketing button, and we're going to see how these things change as I scroll through the options. Now, before we do that, if we read this bar at the bottom, overexposed, properly exposed, underexposed, 3 frames separated by 1 stop, 3 frames separated by 2/3 or 1/3 of a stop. This is now 2 frames, proper and under, separated by a stop, 2/3, 1/3, 2 frames again, proper, well, over first and then proper, separated by a stop, 2/3 of a stop and 1/3 of a stop, back to the beginning. So those are the 9 bracketing options that this camera gives you. And then when you're done, you just hold down bracketing and you can turn it off. All right, so next let's talk about this L button down here. I'd love to show you what it does, but my camera is not cooperating with me, and I don't know if the button's dead or if I just don't understand how to do this, quite frankly. According to the camera's manual, the shutter speed lock can be, you can lock your camera's shutter speed, and I believe that is in the automatic modes. I've tried it in program and Aperture-priority to no avail. When you press and hold this button while rotating the command wheel. So like I said, I'd love to show you how that works, but I can't get it. I can't figure out what I'm doing wrong. The lock button does also have apparently have some ability to lock other functions on the camera as well. So, but again, have not been able to do those, so no idea what is going on. Now, let's say that you've made a lot of different adjustments to your camera, and it's kind of confusing what it's doing, or you've just bought it and you want to restore it to factory defaults and start fresh, getting it everything customized as you want. You can hold down bracket and CSM for about 2 seconds. The screen will flash, and then everything on your camera well, not everything, a number of things have been reset. What it does is it resets your exposure setting to program, your autofocus to single area, your focus area to center, and your flash sync to front curtain. It also cancels your flexible program, EV comp, bracketing, multiple exposures, and all custom functions. Those are all reset to factory defaults when you do that. If you have back MF28, it resets those functions, but it does not erase your data. So, it also erases the locks for your shutter speed and aperture and focus area that you would use with the lock button right here. So, good thing to do when you first get the camera if you want to start off with a clean slate. So we've seen how to do a whole lot. We've done everything but the custom functions on how to set this up. We've seen how functionally all of the shooting aspects of this camera work. So to take a photo, all you have to do, after you've set everything up exactly as you want it, is hold down the shutter button, look through the viewfinder, and you're ready to go. Okay, that's cool. What about double exposures? Push this button down. There we go. Almost got it. Okay, push this button down, and now we can take a double exposure. And it is either double exposure or single exposure. It's not one of these. It's not a camera where you can set multiple frames for a multiple exposure. So what we're going to do is I'm going to set this to single servo or single shot so we can see more easily. Take the first photo. Now it's blinking to tell us that we're about to take our last photo. And we've taken our last double exposure. I'm going to show you guys a trick. Oh, hey, now I can take a triple exposure. Can actually take as many exposures on the same frame as I would like. All I have to do, oops, take my first shot. When it's blinking, set it to another one. When it's blinking, not liking that. All right, let me do 3. I don't do multiple exposures all that often, but this will let you do a double or a triple exposure, which is really all you need. You get much beyond that. It starts getting a little bit confusing. At any rate, what you do for a double exposure is hold this button down, rotate the rear command dial to start a double exposure. To add a third, you push it between your first and second photo and add your third. Okay. If you are in any of the automatic modes, like I am now in Aperture-priority, you can see that at f5, I get a 1/60th of a second exposure. Well, if I turn this on, it's still giving me about 1/60th of a second for an exposure. The way that film works is it can record photons, a certain amount of photons, and the more photons it records, the darker your negative gets, or denser or thicker. So if you have a proper exposure that is 1/40th at f5, and you take a single photo at that setting, you get a properly exposed image. If you take 2, you get a very overexposed image, and that's going to give you digital noise. If you scan it, it's going to reduce your contrast. If you scan it, also if you print it in a darkroom, and if you're in a darkroom, it will make your printing time significantly longer. So when you take a double exposure, what you want to do is hold your EV compensation button down and take away one stop of light. Come on, there we go. Now, our double exposure, instead of being a 40th, is hovering between an 80th and a 100th. And we can take our 2 double exposures that are each getting half as much light because they're one stop. Every stop is half or double from the next one next to it. Light, and that gives you a single negative that is properly exposed. Okay. So that's in manual mode. If you're shooting in manual, it's really easy to do. If you know that f5 and 1/500th is your proper combination, you can either go to 1/1000th of a second, which is half as much light, or f7.1, which is half as much light that way. Matter of personal preference whether you want to control aperture or depth of field with your double exposures. But that's the process for it. Push the button, activate, and turn the wheel to activate the double exposure. Take your 2 photos, and just make sure to compensate if you're using an automatic or semi-automatic mode, and turn off the compensation when you're done, or just adjust your shutter speed or aperture if you're shooting a manual mode. And that is the second video about the Nikon F5. So, in the third video, we're going to go through all of the custom functions and talk about what they are and what they do and how they affect your camera's performance so that you can customize your F5 to be the exact camera you want it to be.